The fourth night was worse. I had started a fire, thinking it would help me feel safer, but it didn't. Around 11, I heard the soft thud of something heavy outside, moving carefully but deliberately. My stomach tightened. I watched the shadows of the trees flicker against the cabin walls, but I didn't see anyone. I considered leaving, driving back down the trail in the dark, but the thought of navigating that rocky road at night terrified me more. So I stayed, clutching a heavy cast-iron pan, listening to every rustle. The sounds came closer. Snap, step, snap, step, and then silence. Morning arrived, gray and overcast. I forced myself to eat and packed a small day bag. I needed to get out, at least to explore a safer route down the mountain. As I moved toward the cabin door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the soft dirt led right up to the cabin, circling it in a careful loop, then fading into the trees. They weren't animal prints. They were human, and they weren't mine. Someone had been here in the night. I debated my options. I could stay put and wait for morning, or I could try to leave immediately. Staying felt dangerous. Leaving without preparation was dangerous too. I chose to leave. I grabbed my bag, checked the car, and stepped onto the trail. The path was steeper than I remembered, and the rocks threatened to twist my ankles with every step. I moved quickly, glancing over my shoulder constantly. The forest seemed denser now, the shadows darker. Every broken branch, every snapped twig made me jump. About halfway down, I heard voices. Not yelling, just soft murmurs. I couldn't make out words. They were human. My pulse quickened. I ducked behind a tree and stayed as still as possible. The voices moved along the trail, following mine, their footsteps deliberate. I didn't dare run. I waited until the sound faded, then hurried down again. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat run down my back. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing where the GPS signal returned, and I realized I was close to a road. I ran the last stretch, stumbling over rocks and roots, my breath ragged. When I finally reached the asphalt, I didn't stop. I kept running until I found a small gas station at the edge of the highway. I collapsed there, exhausted, drenched in sweat and mud. The attendant looked at me strangely as I caught my breath, but I didn't care. I had escaped. Later, I called the local sheriff and reported what had happened. They took my statement seriously, promising to investigate. It turned out that a group of squatters had been living in the woods near that cabin, and they often watched anyone who came close. They had no permanent shelter, but they knew the trails and terrain well, and they weren't afraid to intimidate outsiders. I was lucky. The sheriff warned me that a few people had been robbed and threatened in the same area, but none had been seriously hurt. I didn't go back. I sold my car a few weeks later and never returned to that region. Even now, thinking back, I remember the smell of damp wood, the way the shadows moved against the cabin walls, the sound of footsteps circling the building in the dead of night. I learned to respect the mountains in a new way, not for their beauty, not for their isolation, but for the people who lived there unseen, watching, waiting. That trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it became a lesson in vigilance, in awareness, and in the frightening reality that even in the most remote places, danger can be very close, very real, and completely unexpected. I still dream about it sometimes. The creaking of the cabin, the footprints in the dirt, the night pressing in on all sides. But I also remember the relief of reaching the road, of seeing civilization again, of realizing that careful decisions and quick thinking can make the difference between a close call and disaster. That cabin, that valley, that week. It's burned into my memory, and it will never feel the same again. The mountains are beautiful. They are quiet and peaceful, but they are also home to people who can make that quiet dangerous. And I will never forget how close I came to becoming a story I never wanted to tell. The next day, I knew I had to make a decision. Staying another night felt dangerous. I packed my belongings carefully, double-checked my map and compass, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. Every step was slow and deliberate. I kept my eyes on the forest around me, scanning for movement. I kept my hatchet ready, and my flashlight was easily accessible. The forest felt alive, and I felt very small in comparison. I stayed aware of every sound, every shadow, knowing that one careless move could be dangerous. I encountered several signs of wildlife along the trail: claw marks, paw prints, scat, and broken branches. I realized how close I had been to something potentially dangerous. The thought made me nervous, but I also felt a deep respect for the wild. I knew I had survived because I had stayed calm and alert, not because I was stronger than the animals or the forest. I kept moving, step by step, careful not to trip or stumble. Around midday, I reached a small stream. I stopped to refill my water and rest briefly, knowing I still had several miles to go. As I drank, I noticed more signs of human presence: discarded cans and a faint trail that indicated hikers had passed through before. The trail gave me a sense of relief, knowing that civilization was near, even if I could not see it yet. I kept walking, energized by the thought of safety ahead. Late in the afternoon, I finally emerged from the forest onto a dirt road. The sight of my car parked where I had left it filled me with relief. I felt the tension drain from my body as I approached it. I double-checked my gear, making sure nothing had been damaged or lost. Everything was intact. I started the car and drove slowly back toward the nearest town. My body ached, my clothes were torn and dirty, and my mind was exhausted, but I felt a sense of triumph. I had faced the wild truly alone and survived. The drive home was quiet. I kept replaying the events in my head, remembering every sound, every shadow, every step. I realized that what had made the trip scary was not some supernatural threat, but the real, tangible dangers of being alone in the wilderness. Wildlife, isolation, and the constant need for vigilance. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt tired in a deep, satisfying way. I had pushed myself, faced real fear, and come out the other side. In the days that followed, I reflected on the trip. I realized how much planning, patience, and awareness mattered in the wild. I also knew I would never underestimate nature again. I invested in better gear, learned more about local wildlife, and mapped out future trips with even more caution. I never forgot the feeling of being alone in the forest, the fear that gripped me at night, and the relief of returning to safety. It became a story I told myself to remind me of the thin line between adventure and danger, and the importance of respect for the natural world. Years later, I returned to the forest, but never alone. I brought friends, better equipment, and thorough preparations. The memory of that first solo camping trip stayed with me, a lesson in vigilance, patience, and respect. I had faced fear in its rawest, most realistic form, and emerged with a newfound understanding of what it means to survive. I knew that fear is not something to escape, but something to navigate, using logic, skill, and careful attention. That trip, terrifying as it was, had taught me more about myself and the natural world than I could have imagined. The experience changed the way I approached the outdoors forever. I learned to read the signs of the forest, to understand the habits of animals, to move quietly and deliberately, and to never assume safety simply because I wanted it. I learned that survival is about respect, preparation, and awareness. And most importantly, I learned that real fear, unlike the movies or stories, is something that sharpens your senses, focuses your mind, and ultimately teaches you to value life, safety, and the quiet moments when you can finally relax and know that you have made it through. I never forgot the sounds of that first night, the snapping branches, the rustle of leaves, the low grunts that had kept me awake. They had been terrifying, but they were also a reminder of the world outside the city, a world that exists whether we notice it or not. That night alone in the forest had been one of the scariest experiences of my life, and also one of the most important. I returned home changed, more cautious, more aware, and more appreciative of the thin line between safety and danger. Every camping trip after that, I carried the lessons with me: preparation, awareness, respect, and calmness under pressure. I never again took the forest lightly, never assumed I could control it, and never ignored the signs around me. That first trip, terrifying and exhausting as it was, had taught me survival, and the knowledge that I could rely on myself even in the most frightening circumstances gave me a confidence I would carry forever. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. The plan was simple. Leave the city behind for a long weekend, hike into a remote forested area, and spend a couple of nights alone in a small clearing near a river. I had been camping before, but mostly in well-maintained parks with other people around. This time, I wanted solitude, the rawness of nature without anyone else nearby. I packed everything carefully. A large backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a small stove, a first aid kit, and the usual gear like a flashlight, extra batteries, and a pocket knife. I also made sure my phone was fully charged, though I knew the signal would be poor once I got deep into the woods. I left early in the morning, driving 2 hours until the city faded behind me and the forest grew dense along the road. I parked near a trailhead that led deeper into the woods. The trail started out wide, worn from hikers and bikers, but after about a mile it narrowed, the underbrush closing in. The forest was alive with sounds. Birds calling, wind rustling the leaves, and the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of some unseen animal. At first, it was calming, the kind of quiet that makes you feel small but also peaceful. By midday, I reached a clearing near a small river. It wasn't much, a patch of grass surrounded by trees, but it would do. I set up my tent carefully, anchoring the stakes firmly and laying out my sleeping bag. I started a small fire in a ring of stones I found nearby, just enough for warmth and cooking. I had brought instant noodles, some canned beans, and a small piece of chicken, which I cooked over the fire. As I ate, I looked around the clearing. It was beautiful in a raw way, the river running clear, the sunlight filtering through the tall pines, casting long shadows across the ground. After eating, I explored a bit. I followed the river upstream, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. I noticed tracks in the mud, small animal tracks, maybe deer or raccoon, and the occasional larger print that I couldn't identify immediately. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just normal wildlife. I returned to camp as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the light turning golden through the treetops. I stoked the fire, watched it burn, and then crawled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest surrounding me. I felt alone, yes, but not uncomfortable. The isolation was part of why I was here. The first night was quiet, though I woke a few times to strange noises, branches snapping, rustling in the underbrush, but I told myself it was just animals. I had read enough survival guides to know that bears and larger predators generally avoid humans if given space, and I had taken precautions, keeping my food stored in a sealed container away from the tent. I tried to sleep, letting the rhythmic sound of the river calm me, until morning came, washing the forest in pale light. Day 2 started with a sense of adventure. I planned to hike deeper into the forest, maybe find a small waterfall I had seen marked on an old map. I packed light, leaving the tent and most gear at the clearing, bringing only water, snacks, my knife, and a small first aid kit. The trail was rougher now, less worn, almost invisible in places. Trees leaned over, and roots twisted across the path. I had to be careful with every step, watching where I placed my feet. The forest felt more alive here, more secretive. Birds were fewer, replaced by the occasional distant howl of some animal. I tried to identify it, maybe a coyote, maybe a fox, but it sounded strange, almost too close. I shook the thought away. Hours passed as I hiked. I finally reached the waterfall, a small cascade, maybe 15 feet high, water tumbling into a clear pool below. I sat on a rock, listening to the rushing water, letting the cool spray hit my face. I drank some water and ate a granola bar, taking notes in my small journal about the journey so far. I was tired but satisfied. I started back toward the clearing, following the river, when I noticed something odd. A tree up ahead had fresh claw marks on its trunk, deep grooves running from the base up several feet. I froze, scanning the area. The ground around it had disturbed dirt, footprints, maybe from a deer, but too deep for that. I felt a flicker of unease, my heart picking up pace. I took a careful step back, then moved slowly around the tree. Nothing appeared, just the normal sounds of the forest, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I returned to camp in the late afternoon. The sun was lower now, shadows stretching long across the clearing. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. I had read that being alone in the wilderness can heighten your senses, make ordinary things seem more threatening. I stoked the fire again, cooked my dinner, and kept an eye on the perimeter. Night fell quickly. This time, the forest seemed different. Every sound was amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an unknown animal. I lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, listening. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere just beyond the treeline. I froze. My mind raced. I had expected deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote, but this growl sounded heavier, closer, deliberate. It didn't sound like a casual animal. It sounded like it was sizing me up. I stayed still, barely breathing. The growl repeated, a few seconds apart, and then silence. I considered leaving the clearing, but my pack was at the tent, and it would be hard to move quietly without attracting attention. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Nothing moved, just dark shapes of trees. I tried to tell myself it was a bear or maybe a large dog that had wandered into the forest. I had bear spray, so I kept it in hand, ready. The growl returned, closer now, a rumbling that made my chest tighten. I stayed in the tent, zipped up tightly, and tried to make myself as small and quiet as possible. Every rustle outside made me flinch. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing, ears straining for any sign of movement. The growls came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far, always just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stayed alert until dawn. Morning brought relief, though I was exhausted. Nothing had attacked the camp overnight. I packed my gear quickly, deciding to move closer to the trailhead where I could get out if necessary. As I walked, I noticed more signs of a large animal. Broken branches, deep prints in the mud, and claw marks on more trees. I kept my knife and bear spray ready, moving slowly, deliberately. The trail was rough, but I could follow it. Hours later, I emerged near a small dirt road and finally saw signs of human presence. Tire tracks, discarded wrappers, and the faint sound of a vehicle. I felt a surge of relief. I had survived the night, and the forest's dangers, whatever they had been, were behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked and waiting like a safe harbor. I locked the doors, sat down, and breathed deeply. The experience had been exhausting, terrifying at times, but I had learned a lot about the wilderness, about preparedness, and about staying calm under pressure. I drove home slowly, watching the forest recede behind me. That night, I slept in my own bed. The city sounds comforting instead of intrusive. I thought about the claw marks, the growls, and the feeling of being watched. I would return to the forest someday, but not without careful planning and respect for the wildlife that called it home. That trip had been a wake-up call, a reminder that nature is beautiful, but also unpredictable and dangerous if you are not careful. I had been planning the trip for months, researching the area, mapping out the trails, making lists of supplies, and preparing mentally for being alone in the wilderness. I wanted solitude, a place far from the crowded trails and noisy campers, where I could push myself to endure the kind of raw, unfiltered nature that most people avoided. I chose a remote section of the national forest, far from roads and cell towers, where I could hike for miles without encountering another person. I had done long hikes before, overnight trips with friends, but never anything this isolated, never anywhere this remote. The morning I left, I loaded my pack carefully. Every item had a purpose. I had enough food for 3 days, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, extra clothing, water purification tablets, a compact stove, and all the small essentials: matches, a knife, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries. I double-checked everything, ran through my mental checklist, and locked my car before setting off on the long hike to the campsite I had chosen. The trailhead was already quiet in the early hours, only the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of a bird disturbing the stillness. The hike itself was not easy. The trail started as a faint dirt path, narrowing as it wound through thickening forest. I climbed steep inclines, jumped over fallen logs, and carefully picked my way across slippery rocks near a small creek. My pack was heavy, and the sweat on my back soaked through my shirt. By midday, I had left the last signs of civilization far behind. No houses, no cars, no signs of human presence at all. Just trees, rocks, and the occasional deer grazing quietly in the distance. The isolation was exhilarating at first, a kind of peaceful intensity that made my heart beat faster, my senses sharper. I reached my campsite in the late afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, the forest floor covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. There was a natural windbreak created by a cluster of large boulders, and a small stream ran nearby. I set my pack down and immediately began setting up camp, starting with my tent. I worked methodically, carefully driving stakes into the ground, making sure the rain fly was taut, checking that the seams were secure. Once the tent was up, I gathered firewood, breaking small branches from dead trees and stacking them neatly in a pile. I wanted a fire that night, both for warmth and for the comfort of its presence in the darkness. The first evening was quiet but not unsettling. I built a fire, added a few carefully chosen logs, and watched the flames lick upward, throwing long shadows across the forest floor. I cooked a small meal on my compact stove and drank water from my filtration bottle. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sound. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional crack of a falling branch. I was aware of everything, every little sound sharper than usual, but I felt confident. I knew the forest, at least in theory, and I knew how to take care of myself. That night, I slept uneasily. The forest never truly goes quiet, and every sound seemed amplified. I heard the low rumble of a distant waterfall, the flapping of wings overhead, and at one point, the unmistakable crunch of twigs very close to the tent. I lay still, breathing carefully, convincing myself it was a deer or some small animal. Morning came eventually, with weak sunlight filtering through the dense canopy. I felt sore from the climb in, my back stiff, but alive. The second day, I explored further from the campsite. I followed the stream upstream, noting every twist and turn, the large boulders that formed natural pools, and the small waterfalls cascading over moss-covered rocks. I was alone, but I kept my senses alert. I had read survival guides, studied animal behavior, and I knew enough to understand that accidents happen quickly in the wilderness. I kept track of landmarks so I could find my way back, marking trees with small scratches and stacking stones in obvious patterns. As I moved deeper into the forest, I began noticing signs that unsettled me. Fresh bear tracks in the mud near the stream, scat from an unknown animal, and the occasional broken tree branch that suggested something large had passed through recently. The rational part of my mind told me to remain calm. Bears are generally not aggressive if left alone. Still, the tracks followed a pattern, and I realized that the bear or bears were moving in my general direction. I didn't panic. I stayed on higher ground when possible and avoided low-lying areas with dense brush where a sudden encounter could be dangerous. By late afternoon, I returned to camp, exhausted but invigorated. I decided to build the fire larger that evening, more as a deterrent than for warmth. I cooked my dinner, a simple combination of rice and canned vegetables, and ate slowly, listening to the forest. The wind picked up around sunset, rustling the branches above, and the shadows grew longer. I noticed movement in the periphery of my vision several times, a flash of brown or black that vanished when I looked directly. My mind tried to rationalize it as deer or raccoon, but a part of me remained tense. That night, the unease escalated. Around midnight, I woke to the smell of something musky, heavy, and unmistakably animal. The hairs on my neck stood up. I listened. There was a sound, low and deliberate, like a thump-thump, moving around the edge of my clearing. My flashlight batteries were in my pack, but I hesitated to move, knowing that sudden light or movement could provoke an animal. The thumping continued intermittently, circling the clearing, never too close, but always within earshot. I held my breath, trying to appear non-existent, and eventually the sounds moved away, fading into the distance. Sleep came in fits, interrupted by every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. The next morning, I inspected my surroundings carefully. My firewood pile was disturbed. Several small branches had been pushed aside, and the ground bore the imprint of large paws. I understood immediately. A bear had been investigating, possibly sniffing for food. I checked my supplies. I had stored food properly, in sealed containers, and kept it away from the tent. But the realization of how close the bear had been unsettled me. I spent the day in a heightened state of awareness, staying close to my camp, keeping an eye on the trail leading in and out of the clearing, and moving quietly to avoid drawing attention. Over the next day, I decided to hike further upstream to scout the area and find an escape route if needed. The terrain became rougher, with steep inclines and slippery moss-covered rocks. I took my time, careful not to slip or twist an ankle. I noticed fresh signs of animal activity everywhere: tracks, scat, broken branches. The forest felt alive in a way I had never experienced, and not all of it was pleasant. I moved cautiously, remembering everything I had read about bears and other large animals. Avoid eye contact if you encounter one, back away slowly, make yourself appear large, and never run. On the third night, I faced the most intense scare of the trip. I had finished preparing my campsite, set up the fire, and was eating dinner when I heard the first sounds. Low growls, the sharp snap of twigs. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. The beam caught movement at the edge of the clearing, and I froze. Two bears, large and solid, were approaching, moving silently through the underbrush, their eyes reflecting the light. I backed toward my tent slowly, knowing I had to stay calm. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming to run, but I remembered the advice. I kept the fire between us, shaking a branch to make noise, hoping to assert my presence. The bears circled, sniffing the ground, seemingly aware of me but not aggressive yet. I realized that they were likely searching for food. I had not left anything exposed, but the smell of my cooking could have drawn them. The standoff lasted what felt like an eternity, but in reality was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the bears moved away, heading deeper into the forest, disappearing as silently as they had come. I waited, tense and alert, long after the sounds faded, unwilling to move or even breathe heavily. After that night, I spent the last day packing up carefully, double-checking that no food scraps were left behind, and ensuring my campsite was as undisturbed as possible. The hike out was grueling. My muscles ached. My back was sore from the heavy pack, and my nerves were raw from the close encounter. I moved deliberately, sticking to higher ground, avoiding thick brush, and keeping my senses alert to every sound and movement. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted but immensely relieved. The safety of my car, the knowledge of roads and civilization, was a comfort I had never taken for granted before. Looking back, the trip had been terrifying at times, but it was also a profound lesson in awareness, preparation, and respect for nature. I survived because I stayed calm, respected the wild, and never underestimated the dangers around me. I learned how quickly situations could escalate, how every sound in the forest carried meaning, and how important it was to maintain control of my actions under pressure. The experience left me wary, yes, but also more confident and more connected to the raw power of the wilderness. I drove home slowly, stopping occasionally just to breathe, feeling the weight of the trip in every sore muscle and every racing heartbeat. When I finally arrived home, I unpacked methodically, storing gear and reviewing every step of the trip. I realized that the encounter with the bears, the sleepless nights, the constant awareness, had pushed me to the limits of endurance, patience, and composure. I had come seeking isolation, and I had found it, but with it came the stark reality of being completely vulnerable in the wilderness. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of how small and fragile humans are when removed from the safety of civilization, and how careful preparation, knowledge, and respect can allow survival even in the most intimidating circumstances. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. I needed it. My life had been a constant blur of work deadlines, city noise, and people. Everything felt heavy, and I craved the silence and the emptiness of the wilderness. somewhere I could just be alone with my thoughts and the forest. I picked a small, relatively unknown site deep in the national park, one I had read about online. It promised isolation, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear carefully. A large backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, food for several days, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and a small knife. I made sure I had a map of the area and a compass, even though my phone's GPS could work for a while. I wanted to be prepared, meticulous in every way, because out here there would be no one to call if something went wrong. I arrived at the trailhead just before midday. The air was cold, but not unbearably so. It had rained a few days ago, and the smell of wet earth hung in the air. The trail was narrow, winding through thick pines and moss-covered rocks. As I hiked in, I felt the city fall away. Each step made me feel lighter. The sun was high, casting long shafts of light through the trees, illuminating tiny clouds of insects that danced in the beams. Birds called from far away, but their sounds were distant and cautious, as if even they were wary of being seen. I followed the map carefully, marking my progress by the landmarks I knew. An unusual bent tree, a large boulder split down the middle, a small stream crossing the path. The trail grew rougher the further I went, with roots snaking across the path and loose stones underfoot. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing where I intended to set up camp. It was perfect, a flat area surrounded by thick trees on three sides, and a small clearing in the middle. The ground was covered in pine needles, soft underfoot, and a small stream ran along one edge. It was peaceful, beautiful, and completely isolated. I unpacked my gear, carefully setting up the tent so it faced the clearing, giving me a full view of the forest. I stacked firewood I had collected earlier, arranging it neatly next to the small ring of stones I had used to mark the fire area. Everything was methodical, precise. I wanted to be ready before dark, because even though the forest seemed calm, I knew that night brought a different kind of life. The first night passed uneventfully. I had a small fire, cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans, and watched the shadows stretch across the clearing. The darkness was complete and heavy, the kind that feels like it could swallow you if you let it. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. The wind rustled through the trees, a low, constant hum. Occasionally, I would hear a branch snap in the distance, but it sounded far enough away that I didn't worry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the instinctive awareness that I wasn't entirely alone, that the forest was alive with things I couldn't see. The next day, I decided to explore further. I packed my small day bag with water, a snack, and my knife. I wanted to follow a stream that branched off from the main trail, one I had seen on the map. Promised a small waterfall a few miles upstream. The hike was harder than I expected. The ground was slippery in places, and the trail wasn't well maintained. I had to duck under branches, step over fallen logs, and navigate around thick patches of brush. It was exhausting, but the thought of reaching the waterfall kept me going. The forest felt quiet in a different way, almost unnatural. The usual bird calls were missing, replaced by an eerie stillness. I shook it off as my imagination and pressed on. By late afternoon, I reached the waterfall. It was beautiful, small, maybe 10 feet high, with a pool at the bottom that was crystal clear. I rested on a rock nearby, eating some of my food and letting the sound of the water fill my ears. It was peaceful, but I noticed something odd. Footprints. Human footprints. They were faint, partially washed away by the water, but I could see them clearly enough. They were fresh, maybe from that morning. My heart skipped a beat. I was deep in the forest, far from the main trail. How had someone else gotten here? And why didn't I see them on the trail? I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a day hiker, maybe a local who knew the forest, but the sense of unease remained. I didn't stay long. I returned to my camp quickly, moving quietly and keeping my eyes on the shadows. When I arrived, everything seemed normal. The fire pit was undisturbed, my tent intact. Still, I decided to take precautions. I rearranged some logs around the clearing, forming a kind of barrier, and kept a large stick next to my sleeping bag. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the crack of a branch, the sudden splash of the stream, made me sit up and stare into the dark. I felt exposed, vulnerable. My imagination kept turning the footprints I had seen into people in the dark, moving silently through the trees, watching me. The following morning, I woke early, determined to keep my nerves in check. I packed a small bag and hiked further along the main trail, wanting to get more familiar with the area. I stayed alert, noticing every sound, every movement. Around midday, I found a small clearing that looked perfect for a break. As I rested, I heard it. A low, subtle snapping of branches behind me, coming closer. I froze. My heart pounded. Whoever or whatever was there hadn't made enough noise for me to locate them easily. I slowly reached for my knife, trying not to panic. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the forest eerily quiet again. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing moved. I decided not to linger and returned to camp as quickly as possible. When I got back, the sense of unease had grown. My camp looked exactly as I had left it, but something felt off. The air was thicker, the shadows sharper. I double-checked my supplies, making sure everything was secure. I noticed something small but alarming. A few fresh footprints near the edge of my clearing. They didn't match mine. Someone had been here while I was gone. I didn't know if they were still nearby. Panic hit me in waves. I felt trapped in the forest. I considered leaving immediately, but I had two options: the long way back on the trail or staying put and hoping no one approached. I decided to stay, thinking the trail might expose me if someone was following. That night was worse than the first. Every sound made me tense. The forest felt alive in a way I had never noticed before. I heard distant footsteps moving around the clearing, or maybe they were just branches falling. I gripped my knife and stayed awake as much as I could. Hours passed slowly. Occasionally, I would catch movement through the trees, nothing concrete, just shapes that could be animals or people. The fear was suffocating. I realized how vulnerable I was, alone in the middle of the forest, with no way to call for help if something went wrong. By the next morning, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my gear with trembling hands, checking everything twice. I left no trace, hoping whoever had been nearby wouldn't notice me leaving. I stuck to the trail, moving as quickly and quietly as possible, constantly scanning the trees for movement. After several hours of hiking, I reached the main road. I saw a ranger's truck parked by the trailhead. Relief flooded through me. I approached, explaining where I had been and the footprints I had seen. The ranger took notes and warned me that the area had recently had reports of people trespassing illegally, sometimes following hikers. They assured me the area would be patrolled more frequently. I drove away from the forest with a sense of disbelief. My body was exhausted, my mind still tense from every noise and shadow I had imagined in the past few days. The forest had been beautiful, but it had shown me a side of wilderness I hadn't considered. The unpredictability, the exposure, the reality that people could be just as dangerous as wild animals. I realized that my careful preparation, gear, maps, knowledge, wasn't enough when other humans could be a threat. The trip had been terrifying, but I survived. I learned the hard way to never underestimate the forest, or the people who might be in it without your knowledge. Months later, I went back, but I never camped alone again. I learned to respect the forest, its beauty and its dangers, and to always remain aware. I still hike, still enjoy the wilderness, but now I carry extra precautions. I tell someone exactly where I'm going, and I stay vigilant at all times. That trip had changed me, instilling a caution I had never felt before, and a respect for the quiet, for the solitude, and for the hidden threats that might be out there. The fear I felt in those nights never completely left me, but it became a tool, keeping me alert, alive, and aware. And in the end, that awareness was what kept me safe. I had planned this camping trip for months. My backpack was meticulously packed with everything I thought I would need for a weekend alone in the wilderness. I had chosen a remote area several miles from the nearest road, a place I knew only from topographic maps and a few old forum posts from hikers who had been there years ago. The idea of being completely alone was appealing. No city noise, no strangers, no obligations. Just me, the forest, and the sharp taste of freedom. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, along gravel roads that twisted through thick pine forests and rocky ridges. My car rattled over uneven ground, tires kicking up small clouds of dust. As I approached the trailhead, I parked and grabbed my pack. The trail started gently, winding through a mix of pine and deciduous trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground. The air smelled like damp earth and pine sap, a scent that made me feel alive and alert. The first hour of hiking was easy, almost pleasant. My pack was heavy, but I had trained for this. The trail gradually became steeper, roots and rocks forcing me to pay attention to each step. Every so often, I paused to catch my breath, to look around, and to remind myself of how deep into the forest I was going. The isolation was exhilarating at first. I felt untouchable, like I had entered a part of the world that existed solely for me. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing by a narrow stream. It seemed perfect for setting up camp. I laid out my tent, carefully staking it down and arranging my sleeping bag inside. I gathered firewood, small branches for kindling, larger logs for the fire. The stream's water was clear and cold. I filled my water bottle and even took a few sips, the cold liquid snapping me awake. Everything felt orderly, planned, under control. I was alone, yes, but safe, or so I thought. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the forest started changing. Shadows lengthened, the temperature dropped, and the birds fell silent. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how completely I was cut off from the rest of the world. My phone had no signal, a fact I had expected but hadn't truly felt until that moment. The idea that if something went wrong, I could be stuck here alone, forced me to check my surroundings more carefully. I glanced around, noting the trees, the brush, and the undergrowth, looking for anything unusual. At first, I saw nothing out of place, just the usual signs of wildlife. Bird feathers, tracks in the mud, a squirrel darting across a fallen log. Night fell faster than I expected. I built a fire and watched the flames dance, the crackling comforting. I cooked a small meal over the fire, beans and a dehydrated mix I had brought. The smell of cooking food mixed with smoke, pine, and the faint dampness of the forest. As I ate, I felt a growing unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was the usual paranoia, the mind reacting to the isolation, but the feeling persisted. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go to bed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, the smoke curling lazily into the dark sky. I zipped myself into the tent, laying out my gear carefully around me. I had a small flashlight and a whistle inside, emergency items I had brought, but even with them, the darkness felt suffocating. I tried to sleep, but every sound, an owl hooting, the wind shifting in the branches, the distant splash of water, kept me awake. Then I heard it, a low, consistent rustling coming from the edge of the clearing. I froze. The sound was too deliberate to be wind or a small animal. It moved slowly, circling the tent, the brush bending as if something large was moving through it. My heart started pounding. I reached for my flashlight, and the beam sliced through the darkness. First, I saw nothing. Then I noticed the outline of a figure, hunched, moving slowly between the trees, just beyond the light's reach. My breath caught. My first thought was a person. Someone else here, so far from any road, watching me. I grabbed my knife, a small but sharp camping blade, and quietly moved to unzip the tent slightly to get a better view. The figure paused whenever my light hit it, then moved again when I lowered the beam. I stayed still, trying to listen. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made my stomach knot tighter. I thought about the forest rules, about the bear spray I had brought, about the whistles and emergency flares. My mind raced with scenarios. What if it was someone lost like me? What if it was someone with bad intentions? Hours passed. The figure stayed near the edge of the clearing, moving around but never approaching closer. Eventually, I realized it had to be an animal, perhaps a deer or even a bear, but its movements were deliberate in a way that no deer I had ever seen moved. My fear didn't lessen. It only changed. I wasn't sure if I was being watched by a human or a large predator. Both were terrifying. By early morning, the figure was gone. I stayed in the tent until daylight, unwilling to move. When I finally emerged, the forest seemed normal again, almost innocent under the morning sun. Tracks in the mud told a story. Large, human-like footprints, but oddly shaped, dragging slightly in places as if the person or animal had been unsteady. My stomach churned. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay another second. The hike back was tense. Every sound made me jump. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see the figure again. The forest that had seemed so inviting the day before now felt oppressive, filled with hidden threats. When I finally reached the car, relief washed over me in a physical wave. I locked the doors, checked the back seat, and sat for a long time, just breathing and trying to calm my racing heart. Driving back, I couldn't shake the sense of being followed. Every shadow in the trees seemed like eyes watching me. Every deer crossing the road a potential threat in disguise. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit highway, surrounded by other cars and people. Only then did the tension start to lift, replaced by exhaustion. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about that night. I went over the events, trying to rationalize them. I convinced myself it was a bear, or maybe a lost hiker, but part of me couldn't let go of the possibility it was something else. Something I didn't see clearly, but that had observed me with intent. The experience left me more cautious, more aware of how isolated a human can be in the wilderness, and how quickly comfort can turn to fear. I didn't return to that forest, but I still think about it. I learned that even the most carefully planned trip can be unpredictable, that the forest holds its own rules and timelines, and that fear doesn't need a ghost or monster. It thrives in silence, darkness, and uncertainty. I also learned the value of preparation and vigilance. That night changed me, made me respect the wilderness in a deeper, more visceral way, and reminded me that sometimes survival isn't about fighting what you see. It's about understanding the limits of what you don't. I had always been drawn to the wilderness. There was something about the isolation, the rawness of nature, and the way everything felt immediate and alive that I could never replicate in the city. The idea of a weekend camping trip alone had always fascinated me. The thought of cutting myself off from modern distractions and relying entirely on my instincts. It was mid-September when I decided to finally make it happen, choosing a stretch of forest I had scouted months earlier, a place deep enough to feel remote but still accessible by a rough, dirt road. I packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, and enough survival gear to keep myself safe. But as thorough as I tried to be, nothing could truly prepare me for what awaited in the forest that weekend. The drive there was long, winding through mountain roads that alternated between sharp switchbacks and stretches of straight asphalt lined with dense trees. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a shifting pattern of gold and green that danced across my dashboard. As I climbed higher, the air grew cooler and thinner, carrying the faint, crisp scent of pine. I felt a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation, as though I were leaving one world behind and stepping into another, one where I would be alone with nothing but the forest. I arrived at the trailhead around 4 in the afternoon. There were signs warning hikers of the rugged terrain and the possibility of wildlife encounters, but otherwise, the place seemed abandoned. I checked my gear one last time, tightened the straps on my backpack, and started down the narrow trail. The forest immediately swallowed me. The sounds of the distant road faded quickly, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the occasional snapping of twigs underfoot, and the high-pitched trill of unseen birds. I had planned to set up camp near a small creek I had discovered during my previous reconnaissance, about a 3-hour hike in. The trail was steeper than I remembered. Loose soil and hidden rocks forced me to watch every step. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows that stretched between the trees. By the time I reached the creek, the forest was dimming rapidly, the canopy thick enough that only streaks of fading sunlight reached the ground. I set up my tent on a flat patch of earth near the water, careful to clear the area of sharp rocks and branches. I built a small fire pit and collected enough wood to last the night, arranging the pieces in a careful teepee formation. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of fallen leaves and moss. The creek murmured quietly nearby, a gentle reminder of life continuing in the quiet depths. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans and ate while seated on a flat rock near the fire. The flickering flames cast shadows that seemed to move independently of any logical source, making the forest feel simultaneously alive and threatening. My mind began to wander, imagining shapes just beyond the light of the fire, imagining sounds as more than they were. I reminded myself that the forest was full of animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. But I had food packed carefully, and the fire should keep anything curious at a distance. Still, as the night deepened, the sounds of the forest intensified. I could hear twigs snapping in the distance, and at first, I tried to dismiss it as small animals, but the sounds were irregular, deliberate, almost as if someone or something was moving through the trees with intention. My pulse quickened. I checked my surroundings, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight, straining to see any shape moving among the trunks. Nothing, yet the sensation of being watched remained, crawling across my skin like ice. I tried to focus on my breathing, telling myself it was the isolation making my mind play tricks. Around midnight, the noises changed. The snapping of twigs became closer, heavier, accompanied by low, muffled thuds that suggested something larger. A branch cracked sharply behind me, and I froze. The firelight barely reached far enough to illuminate the trees beyond the clearing. But I thought I saw a movement, a large shadow shifting behind a thick cluster of oaks. My heart raced. I remembered reading survival guides that warned against panicking, but the advice did little to calm me. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it slowly across the darkness, the beam cutting through the night like a knife. There was nothing, but the feeling of proximity was undeniable. I realized that whatever it was patient. It was not a deer or raccoon, it was something deliberate. I quietly grabbed my knife, sliding it from its sheath, the cold metal a strange comfort in my trembling hand. Hours passed like this. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed alive. At one point, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a figure crouching behind a tree, but when I swung my light toward it, nothing was there. Sleep became impossible. I considered hiking out in the middle of the night, but the steep trail and darkness made that dangerous. The creek, which had seemed so tranquil earlier, now sounded menacing, the gurgle of the water like a warning. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I dozed fitfully in the tent, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. The dreams were fragmented, a mix of running through trees, hearing footsteps behind me, the fire going out. I woke to the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow, and the faint rustle of leaves above. It was early morning, the first gray light filtering through the forest canopy. I lay still for a while, listening, trying to determine if I had imagined everything or if someone had truly been out there with me. The morning revealed signs I could not ignore. Footprints, large and uneven, circled the clearing, partially obscured by fallen leaves but unmistakably human. I examined them carefully, noting the depth and spacing. Whoever had been there had been waiting, watching me, staying just beyond the firelight. My stomach churned. I packed my gear quickly, not wanting to linger, and moved cautiously along the trail, glancing back constantly. The hike out was tense. Every sound made me stop. A deer jumped from the brush once, and I jumped nearly out of my skin, heart racing. By late morning, I emerged onto the dirt road, relief flooding through me. My car was exactly where I had left it, but I circled it, checking the perimeter. No signs of anyone nearby. I sat behind the wheel, shaking, still trying to process the events of the night. Once I was on the paved road and heading back toward civilization, the fear gradually receded, replaced by exhaustion and a creeping sense of disbelief. I had survived, but the memory of being watched, the footprints around my campsite, and the cold dread of that night stayed with me. I realized that even in the wilderness, alone, human threats could be as terrifying as any predator. In the following days, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They noted that while the area was typically quiet, there had been reports of transient campers and hikers who sometimes followed others for reasons unknown, curiosity, perhaps, or malice. The ranger emphasized caution, the importance of letting someone know your route and schedule. I felt both vindicated and shaken. Weeks later, I returned to the same area during daylight to inspect the trail and the creek. Nothing had changed materially, but the knowledge of that night remained. I scouted higher, more open areas for future camping, avoiding the isolated clearing. I began hiking with a partner, someone else aware of my route, both for safety and peace of mind. The experience had taught me a crucial lesson about solitude in the wilderness, not to fear nature itself, but to respect the unpredictability of human presence in spaces that feel empty but are not. The forest, I realized, held no malice, no supernatural threat. Its danger came from its wildness, its indifference, and from the people who might also wander its paths with intentions unknown. The fear I felt that night was raw, real, and human. I learned to carry more than just food and water. Awareness, preparation, and caution were essential companions in the wilderness. That trip changed the way I approached camping permanently. I became meticulous with my planning, always leaving detailed notes about where I would be, carrying reliable communication devices, and trusting my instincts when something felt wrong. I also learned to recognize the signs of someone watching or following, understanding that the wilderness could be as threatening for what it concealed as for what it revealed. Even years later, I remember the crunch of leaves under invisible footsteps, the cold night air pressing against my face, and the way my heartbeat seemed loud enough to echo through the trees. It became a story I would tell sparingly, a reminder of the fragility of solitude and the real dangers that exist even when you think you are alone. The ending of that night was simple. I survived. I made it back, intact physically, but changed in a way that only those who have truly faced uncertainty alone can understand. The clarity of daylight brought safety, but the night had taught me vigilance, respect for the forest, and wariness of other humans. Lessons that became my new guide whenever I stepped into the wilderness. I never returned to that exact clearing. Instead, I found other spots, places with more visibility, gentler terrain, and safer trails. I continued camping, continued hiking, but never again without the sense of awareness that night instilled in me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves now carries my attention, not fear, but preparedness. And though the experience was terrifying, I can say with certainty that I walked away stronger, wiser, and with a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between human solitude and the presence of others in the wild. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple: a solo camping trip deep in the mountains, away from any trails, roads, or other people. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of isolation that forces you to confront yourself in ways the city never allows. I had gone over my gear countless times, making sure my backpack was properly packed with everything I might need: water filtration system, extra food, first aid kit, warm clothing, fire-starting tools, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, and a compass with a map of the area. I was meticulous, almost obsessively so. I told myself that careful planning was the only way to prevent things from going wrong. I was wrong. The first day of the hike was exhilarating. I drove early in the morning to the trailhead, parked my car in a small dirt lot, and began the climb. The forest started as a gentle slope, with tall pines lining the trail and the sunlight filtering through their branches. Birds sang intermittently, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I felt a sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being completely alone with nature. There were signs of life: deer tracks in the mud, a squirrel darting across my path, but nothing alarming. Everything seemed safe, ordinary. By mid-afternoon, I had gone further than I had initially planned. I had left the trail hours ago to find a small clearing that I could use as my campsite. The map suggested a valley with a slow-moving stream nearby. I wanted water close by, not just for drinking, but because the sound of running water is soothing at night and masks other noises, or so I had read. After a grueling climb over rocky terrain, I found it. A small clearing about the size of a bedroom, surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest. The stream ran a few yards away, clear and cold. Perfect, I thought. I set up my tent on slightly elevated ground to avoid flooding if it rained. I cleared the area of sticks and stones, laid out my sleeping pad and bag, and stored my backpack inside the tent to keep it dry. I collected firewood, careful to pick dry branches, twigs, and pine cones. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the clearing. The forest grew quiet, except for the soft burbling of the stream. I started a fire, struggling at first to get the kindling to catch. When the flames finally roared to life, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. I cooked my dinner, instant noodles I had boiled in my pot over the flames, and sat back to enjoy the warmth. The sky turned shades of orange and pink before fading to deep purple. Stars began to appear, scattered across the sky, and the air grew cold. I wrapped myself in my jacket, watching the firelight flicker against the surrounding trees. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. The first night was restless. The isolation, combined with the sounds of the forest, kept me alert. I could hear small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Around midnight, a strange sound reached my ears. It was low, guttural, and rhythmic, something heavy moving through the woods. I froze, straining to identify it. My mind immediately conjured up worst-case scenarios. Bears, mountain lions, maybe even humans. But the sound was deliberate, not like a random animal. It moved closer, the breaking of twigs becoming more distinct. My heart raced, but I stayed still, hoping it would pass. Hours passed with nothing coming into sight, and eventually exhaustion won. I fell into a shallow sleep, waking several times to check the perimeter. Every rustle made my pulse spike, but the night stayed empty. Morning came with the golden light filtering through the trees, and I rationalized that the previous night had been paranoia fueled by isolation. The second day, I planned to explore the area and familiarize myself with escape routes in case something went wrong. I kept my knife strapped to my belt and my phone in a waterproof pouch. Even though I knew the signal was probably non-existent this far into the wilderness, having it nearby gave me a small sense of control. I walked along the stream, making mental notes of landmarks. A large rock formation, a fallen tree that leaned against another like a natural bridge, a clearing where the sun hit the ground in a perfect circle. I thought about the logistics, water source, firewood, shelter, and felt confident. I was surviving well. But then I noticed something strange. Along the stream bank, there were tracks, deep, wide footprints, not human but something large. Bears, I thought, but I had never seen prints that large before. The claw marks were evident, and the spacing between steps suggested a massive creature. I followed them cautiously for a while, observing from a distance. The tracks led further into the forest, away from the open clearing. My heart sank. I had underestimated how close I could be to a potentially dangerous animal. I made a mental note to be vigilant at night and to keep my fire going. That evening, as darkness fell, the forest felt heavier. I double-checked my perimeter, making sure all food was stored away from the tent and secured in my backpack. I set up extra layers of firewood and kept the fire burning higher than usual. The same low, heavy sound returned, moving around the clearing. I didn't dare look directly toward it, but I could feel it circling, aware of my presence. Every snap of a branch and rustle of leaves sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. I stayed near the fire, every muscle tense, until exhaustion again forced me to sleep, sitting upright against my backpack. On the third day, I realized I could not stay put forever. The animal, whatever it was, had learned my pattern. Its movements were cautious, observing, testing. I decided to relocate slightly, moving the camp a few hundred meters further up the slope, to a smaller clearing that overlooked a denser section of forest. I packed slowly, checking behind me constantly for signs of movement. The new location offered less open space, but a higher vantage point, which I hoped would give me a strategic advantage if the animal came close. The relocation process was exhausting, carrying the tent, sleeping bag, and supplies over uneven, rocky ground made me sweat despite the cold. When I finally reached the new clearing, I collapsed briefly to catch my breath before setting up again. The stream was now farther away, which worried me. I boiled water from small puddles and melted snow where I could, but I knew this would limit my time here. Still, I convinced myself it was safer. That night, the sound returned, louder this time, closer. I could hear it moving through the brush, heavy, deliberate steps, sometimes accompanied by low grunts or sighs of breath. I could not see it, but I knew it was watching, assessing. Fear settled in my chest like a solid weight. I stayed awake, clutching my knife, keeping the fire alive. Hours passed, and I felt trapped in a tense, suspended nightmare, unable to rest properly. Morning brought little relief. I packed more cautiously this time, deciding to leave entirely. I would hike back toward the main trail, even if it meant retracing my path through dangerous terrain. I left early, using the sunlight to my advantage, keeping alert for tracks or sounds. The forest felt alive, each sound magnified. I followed the stream upstream to find a safer path, hoping the moving water would guide me. Midday, I realized my mistake. I had underestimated the terrain. The area became steep, rocky, and uneven. My ankle twisted on a loose stone, sending a sharp pain through my foot. I limped, but continued, determined not to stop. Then I heard it again. Heavy footsteps behind me, matching my pace, not directly chasing but close enough to make my skin crawl. Panic set in. I moved faster, trying to keep calm, but the uneven ground made it difficult. Every step was a gamble. By late afternoon, I reached a small ridge that offered a clear view of a distant trail, the one that would lead me out. Relief surged through me, but the forest behind me was still alive with the heavy presence, just out of sight. I knew the animal could strike if I made a mistake. I descended carefully, using rocks and roots for support. When I finally reached the main trail, I stayed low, moving quickly but cautiously. It took several hours of careful hiking, but eventually, I saw the faint outline of other hikers in the distance, returning from a day trip. I waved frantically, desperate for any sign of human presence. They noticed me and directed me toward a ranger station a few miles away. Exhausted, dehydrated, and trembling, I followed. The ranger listened to my story, examined my maps, and nodded gravely. He explained that the area had a population of unusually large black bears, known to stalk campsites for days before striking. My instincts to relocate and stay vigilant had likely saved my life. Back at my car, I looked at the mountains I had just climbed, the dense forest, the small clearings. What had felt like a serene adventure had been a fight for survival. I drove away slowly, glancing at the trees as the distance grew. The fear, the tension, the constant awareness of being watched. It all lingered, but I survived. Every detail, every cautious decision, every small action had mattered. I had been terrified, yes, but I had made it out alive, and that reality, clear and undeniable, was more satisfying than any adrenaline-fueled thrill. I had come for solitude and challenge, and I got both, though in a way I would never forget. From that trip onward, I respected the wilderness in ways I never had before. The mountains were not just beautiful. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and alive. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, every footprint mattered. And I had learned, painfully, that preparation and caution were the only things standing between me and disaster. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to escape the city, the noise, the constant rush of life, and find a place deep in the wilderness where the only sound would be the wind through the trees and maybe the distant call of a bird. I packed my gear carefully, checking and double-checking everything I might need. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, extra fuel, food that could last days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a compass, a map, a multi-tool, rope, and an emergency whistle. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. The last thing I wanted was to get caught unprepared in the middle of nowhere. I drove for hours, leaving behind the hum of traffic, the constant blare of horns, the flashing lights of advertisements, until I finally turned onto a narrow, gravel road that twisted through dense forest. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches creating a sort of tunnel above me. The air felt different here, cooler and cleaner, carrying a faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sky was fading to a muted orange and purple as the sun lowered behind the hills. I knew I had just enough time to find a suitable spot to set up camp before darkness fell completely. After about an hour of driving down the winding road, I spotted a small clearing near a river. The sound of flowing water was faint but calming. I parked my car on a flat patch of ground and stepped out. The ground was soft with pine needles and slightly damp from earlier rain. I could see where other campers had been before. Flattened patches of grass, a few scattered stones for fire pits, and remnants of charred wood. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness, the way I always did before going deep into the wild alone. There was a thrill in knowing I would be completely on my own, reliant only on my skills, my gear, and my instincts. I unpacked my gear carefully, setting up the tent first. The poles were heavy, but solid, and the fabric was strong. I hammered in the stakes, ensuring everything was taut and secure. I laid out my sleeping bag and rolled up a foam pad underneath for comfort. Next, I gathered some dry kindling and small branches to start a fire. The sky was darkening rapidly now, and the forest was beginning to change. Shadows grew longer and deeper, the trees appearing like dark silhouettes against the fading light. The wind whispered through the leaves in a way that was almost hypnotic. I lit the fire, the small flame flickering against the encroaching darkness, casting long shadows on the nearby trees and the riverbank. The warmth was immediate, comforting, and necessary as the temperature began to drop sharply. I ate a simple meal. Some canned beans warmed over the fire, a piece of bread, and a little chocolate for energy. I felt a quiet satisfaction in the simplicity of it. No noise from cars, no phones ringing, no deadlines. Just me, the fire, the trees, and the river. I washed my dishes in the water and made sure to keep the fire small but steady. Darkness had fully taken over now, and the forest felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. Every small sound, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant splash of water, seemed amplified. I reminded myself that I was alone, and yet entirely capable, that I had done everything possible to prepare, and that the forest was indifferent. It was nothing personal, just nature existing in its own way. After cleaning up, I crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to settle down to rest. The night was silent except for the gentle gurgle of the river and the occasional hoot of an owl. I closed my eyes and thought about the hike I would take in the morning, about exploring deeper into the woods, about finding high ground for a better view. Eventually, I drifted off, cocooned in warmth and the soft sounds of the forest. I woke sometime in the middle of the night, although I couldn't tell exactly when. The first thing I noticed was the wind. It had picked up, whistling through the trees with a persistent, uneasy rhythm. My tent flapped in response, the poles creaking. I checked the flap and tugged on the stakes to make sure nothing had come loose. Everything was intact. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound from the direction of the river. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the water hitting rocks, or maybe some fallen branch moving with the wind. But the sound persisted, deliberate and uneven, like something moving through the underbrush. My stomach tightened. I reminded myself that I had been in forests before, that animals moved around at night, that it could be a deer, a raccoon, or even a stray dog. Still, there was a weight to it, a tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I unzipped the tent partially, just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers, giving off more heat than light. Beyond the flickering glow, I could see nothing clearly, only shadowed shapes and the occasional reflection of the moon on the river. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again. A branch snapped somewhere further up the bank. Something was definitely moving, And it wasn't quiet or timid like an ordinary animal. It was deliberate. It was methodical. My heart raced, but I reminded myself to breathe, to stay calm. Panicking would get me nowhere. I reached for my flashlight and switched it on, sweeping the beam slowly over the trees and the riverbank. Nothing moved. Everything seemed empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed in that position for a long time, listening, watching, waiting. Eventually, the sounds faded, leaving only the ambient noise of the night forest. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that the mind played tricks in the dark. I checked my gear and made sure my knife and whistle were within reach before finally trying to sleep again. But sleep came fitfully, and I awoke repeatedly to the sound of branches breaking, leaves rustling, and that low, heavy breathing sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. By the time morning came, I was tense and exhausted. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. I started packing up my campsite slowly, methodically, but I couldn't shake the memory of the night. I decided to follow the river upstream, reasoning that higher ground would give me a better view of the area and perhaps a safer sense of orientation. My steps were careful, crunching on the damp forest floor, eyes constantly scanning for movement. I kept my knife in hand, just in case. The river narrowed as I climbed. The forest became denser, and the trees grew in odd patterns, some leaning over the water as if straining to touch it. Small animals scurried away at my approach. I could hear birds singing in the branches above, a sound that somehow made the tension in my chest worse instead of better. The forest felt alive in a more intense way than it had the day before, more aware, more alert. I reached a bend in the river where a large rock formation jutted out, forming a natural overlook. I stopped and took a deep breath, trying to calm my mind. From this height, I could see farther, and it helped. The river curved through the forest, a silver ribbon in the green and brown of the trees. There were no signs of other humans, no campsites, no roads, no footprints other than my own. That realization was comforting but also terrifying. I was completely alone, truly isolated. I spent some time examining the terrain, looking for paths back, noting landmarks, and considering the safest route down. The forest was not uniform, and missteps could lead to dangerous terrain or injury. I marked a few trees with pieces of rope from my pack to ensure I could retrace my steps. Then I continued upstream, moving carefully along the bank. The further I went, the less traveled the area seemed. Branches blocked my way, roots tripped me, and I had to wade through shallow sections of the river. My legs were wet, my hands scratched from thorny bushes, and sweat dampened my back even though the morning was cool. I kept going, driven by curiosity, determination, and a need to keep moving so my mind wouldn't dwell on the fear from the previous night. Around midday, I found a small clearing where the forest opened up into a meadow. Sunlight bathed the tall grass in a golden glow, and for a moment, I felt relief. It was beautiful, serene, and peaceful. I rested there, ate some of my food, and drank water after purifying it with tablets. My body ached from the climb and the rough terrain, but my spirit felt lighter in the open air. The meadow gave me confidence that I could navigate through this wilderness, that I could rely on myself, my skills, and my preparation. I spent time studying the map again, comparing landmarks, ensuring I would be able to find my way back safely. I also took note of the clouds, the wind, and the time. Nature required respect and awareness, and I felt increasingly attuned to it. As afternoon approached, I decided it was time to head back. I had explored enough, and I was beginning to feel the first twinges of hunger and fatigue. I traced my steps back to the overlook, then carefully descended toward the river. The forest seemed different in the late afternoon light, softer, warmer, less threatening. Yet I remained vigilant. I moved slowly, ensuring each foot had a secure placement, watching for loose stones or slippery mud. The river provided a constant reference, guiding me back toward my campsite. By the time I neared the original clearing, the sun was low, casting long, warm rays across the forest floor. I spotted my campsite almost immediately. Everything was as I had left it. The tent still standing, the fire pit intact, though the fire had cooled completely. Relief washed over me, but I remained cautious. I gathered dry wood and started a fire to warm myself and prepare a meal. I cooked slowly, savoring the taste of food that required effort to make, appreciating the warmth and light from the flames. Night fell again, but this time I was prepared differently. I set a perimeter around the campsite using branches and rocks, just as a precaution. I arranged my flashlight and knife within reach and kept a watchful eye toward the trees. Hours passed, and the forest made its usual sounds. Wind in the leaves, water in the river, occasional distant calls. Nothing moved closer this time. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deeper, more restful, and I woke to a bright morning, feeling stronger and more confident. I packed up my gear carefully, taking extra time to leave the campsite clean, ensuring no trace of my presence remained. The hike back to my car was long but uneventful. I moved at a steady pace, tracing the landmarks I had noted, using the rope markers to confirm my route. When I finally reached the gravel road, the sight of my car felt like salvation. I loaded my gear, locked the doors, and sat for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling a sense of accomplishment and relief. Driving back toward civilization, the forest fading behind me, I reflected on the experience. It had been frightening at times, testing my endurance, my awareness, and my ability to stay calm under pressure. I had encountered moments that forced me to confront fear and isolation directly, but I had relied on preparation, patience, and attention to detail. I had survived, learned, and gained a deeper respect for the wilderness. The memory of the sounds at night, the tense hours alone in the dark, stayed with me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I had faced them and emerged safely. By the time I returned to the city, I felt different. More grounded, more aware of what it meant to be alone, to rely entirely on oneself, and to respect the raw, indifferent power of nature. The trip had been frightening, yes, but it had also been exhilarating and transformative. I had survived my time in the wilderness not by luck, but by preparation, observation, and careful action. And that understanding left me with a quiet, lasting sense of confidence, clarity, and gratitude for both the wild and the ability to navigate it. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a chance to escape the noise and constant motion of the city. I had planned it alone because I wanted the solitude, the quiet that comes from being in the middle of nature where no one can reach you. I packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, plenty of food, water, a first aid kit, and extra clothes for all weather. I made sure to include a flashlight, extra batteries, and a sturdy pocket knife. I left early in the morning, driving for hours until the city was nothing but a smudge of concrete and traffic behind me. The forest I had chosen was remote, not popular with tourists, not close to any major trails. I wanted the feeling of isolation, the kind of quiet where you could hear yourself breathe. As I drove along the winding dirt roads, I saw signs of life: birds flitting through the trees, deer grazing in small clearings, squirrels scurrying up trunks, but no humans. That was exactly what I wanted. I finally found a small clearing near a creek that seemed perfect. It was secluded, sheltered by tall pine trees, and the ground was relatively flat, perfect for pitching a tent. I set up my camp slowly, taking care to get the tent properly staked so it wouldn't collapse if it rained. I arranged my supplies neatly, stacking the food inside a dry bag to protect it from moisture and wildlife. The creek was close enough to provide water for washing and drinking if I boiled it, but far enough not to make noise dominate the campsite. Once the tent was set up and everything organized, I walked along the creek to get a feel for the area. The sunlight filtered through the pine needles in golden beams, and everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. That first night, I built a small fire and sat beside it, watching the flames flicker and listening to the forest. The sound of the creek running over rocks was calming, a soft background to the occasional bird call or rustle of small animals. I cooked a simple meal on the camping stove, nothing fancy, just some pasta with canned sauce. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the solitude. As darkness fell, the forest changed. Shadows grew long and deep, and the sounds became sharper. The snap of a twig, the scurrying of something small in the underbrush. I felt a thrill in my chest, the kind of nervous excitement that comes from being alone in a vast, unfamiliar environment. I went to bed early, laying inside my sleeping bag, the thin walls of the tent barely muffling the sounds outside. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something moving. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or some other small animal, but then I realized it was heavier, larger steps, moving slowly around the perimeter of my campsite. My heart started pounding. I lay still, trying not to make a sound, listening to the steps pause and resume. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me. I had left my pocket knife within reach and my flashlight on the ground beside me, ready in case I needed it. The steps stopped abruptly, and I could hear heavy breathing, uneven and slow. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The sound circled the tent, and then it was gone. I waited for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any noise, but the forest was quiet again except for the creek. I never saw what it was that had walked around my camp, but the experience left me tense and uneasy. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful, filled with dreams of being watched. The next morning, I packed a small day pack with essentials and decided to explore the surrounding area. I followed the creek upstream, moving cautiously, aware that I was alone and vulnerable. The terrain was rougher than I expected. There were fallen logs, steep banks, and thick underbrush. As I walked, I noticed signs of larger animals. Deep claw marks on tree trunks, tufts of fur caught on branches, and large droppings that I couldn't immediately identify. I reminded myself to stay calm, to avoid startling anything, and kept moving, eyes scanning constantly. By late afternoon, I realized I had wandered further than I intended. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I decided to turn back, but when I tried to retrace my steps, nothing looked familiar. I had lost the trail. Panic rose slowly but steadily in my chest. I tried to remain calm, recalling the small landmarks I had passed. A distinctive tree with a split trunk, a rock formation along the creek, but none of it seemed to match. Every direction looked the same. Dense trees, underbrush, fallen branches, and the soft, muddy sound of the creek somewhere off to my left. Hours passed as I tried to find my way back. I marked trees with small scratches of my knife so I could track my path, but every time I thought I was going in the right direction, the terrain shifted, confusing me. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest became a dark, confusing maze. I stopped to rest against a tree, trying to think clearly. My stomach growled from hunger, and my throat was dry. I had water, but I knew I would have to boil it before drinking. As darkness fell completely, the forest became alive with sound. Rustling leaves, snapping branches, and distant, guttural growls that sent a shiver down my spine. I realized I was not just lost but possibly being stalked by a large predator. The tracks I had seen earlier were from something powerful, maybe a bear. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to move quietly, looking for a clearing where I could climb a tree or create some defensive position if needed. I found a small rise with dense branches and climbed up carefully, dragging my backpack behind me. From there, I could see some distance, but the darkness was too thick to identify anything clearly. I sat quietly, knife in hand, listening. Hours passed. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow looked like a threat. I was exhausted but knew I could not sleep on the ground. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement. A large dark shape moving across the forest floor, close to where I had come from. My heart skipped. I tried to remain perfectly still, willing it not to notice me. The shape moved slowly, sniffing the ground, then disappeared into the darkness. I realized I had no choice but to try to make my way back toward where I thought the creek and campsite were. Staying put would only delay me until morning, and I didn't know if whatever was out there would leave me alone. I descended carefully and moved slowly through the trees, feeling every branch and root with my feet. The darkness was nearly total, and I had only my flashlight, which I used sparingly to avoid drawing attention. The forest seemed endless, But eventually, the faint sound of running water reached my ears. Relief surged through me. I moved toward it, the sound growing louder until I finally saw the glint of the creek under moonlight. I knew the campsite had to be nearby. When I arrived, my heart sank. The area looked disturbed. My tent was partially collapsed, and the fire pit had been dug through, ashes scattered. Food wrappers were gone, but more troubling were the tracks. Enormous paw prints circling the area, clearly made by a large bear. I realized it had been watching me the entire time, maybe even while I slept. Panic hit me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the safety advice. Never run, make yourself appear larger, and slowly back away from the animal if it returned. I packed everything quickly, knowing I could not stay. My plan was to hike out immediately, following the creek downstream, hoping it would lead to a road or trail. I kept my knife ready, flashlight in hand, and moved carefully, scanning constantly. Hours passed. Every sound of breaking branches or rustling leaves made me jump, but I kept moving, following the creek and using landmarks I could recognize from daylight. Exhaustion and fear made it hard to think, but I kept pushing. By the time the sun began to rise, I had put significant distance between myself and the campsite. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the distant sound of tires on gravel. My pulse raced. I moved toward it, staying low but moving quickly. Soon, I emerged onto a narrow dirt road. Relief washed over me. I saw a passing car and waved frantically. The driver stopped, looking surprised but concerned. I explained quickly, showing signs of exhaustion and distress, and they offered me a ride to the nearest ranger station. At the ranger station, I reported the bear activity and the damage to my campsite. The rangers were concerned, noting that the bear seemed unusually aggressive, possibly hungry or territorial. They gave me water, food, and a place to rest. The feeling of safety, the simple presence of other people, was overwhelming after the fear and isolation of the forest. I learned later that the bear had been roaming the area for several days, and that it was likely attracted to my camp by the smell of food. The rangers assured me that the forest was safe if precautions were taken, but it was clear that my experience had been dangerous and that I had been lucky to escape unharmed. By the time I left the ranger station and began the drive home, I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. My mind replayed every detail of the night. The sound of the steps around my tent, the dark shape moving through the trees, the fear that had driven me forward. But there was also a sense of accomplishment, a hard-earned understanding of the forest's power and the care it demanded. I had survived, and I knew exactly how to plan differently next time. Food stored in bear-proof containers, a campsite chosen with better visibility, and always respecting the animals that shared the forest with me. In the end, what had started as a peaceful escape became one of the most frightening experiences of my life. The forest was beautiful, but it was wild, untamed, and unpredictable. I had faced that reality alone and come through it safely. I knew I would never forget the fear, the adrenaline, and the lesson I had learned. Nature is not just a backdrop for relaxation. It is a living world that commands respect, preparation, and constant awareness. That trip changed the way I approached camping forever, teaching me that survival is not just about skills, but about patience, observation, and the careful balance of courage and caution. I had always been drawn to the quiet places, the ones far from the roads and towns, where the trees were thick and the air smelled like earth and pine. I had camped many times before, but this trip was meant to be different. I was going into a more remote section of the forest I had heard about from a map in an old outdoor magazine. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. I packed lightly but carefully. My backpack carried the essentials: a small tent, sleeping bag, water, food that could last a week, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a compass, and a knife. I also brought a few comfort items: a small journal and pen to write in, a camera, and a thermos for hot water. I had done this enough times that I thought I could handle anything nature would throw at me. I didn't know then how wrong I was. The trail to the campsite was narrow, often overgrown with tall grasses and shrubs, and the forest canopy was so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Birds were singing, insects buzzing, and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots echoed in the silence. I kept my eyes on the path, but often looked around to admire the towering trees and the small streams cutting through the undergrowth. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, a quiet breathing that seemed comforting. I found a clearing after a few hours, wide enough for a small campsite, surrounded by thick brush that gave a sense of privacy and security. I set up my tent in a flat area, staked it carefully, and unpacked my supplies. The process was slow, methodical, almost ritualistic. By late afternoon, I had built a small fire pit from rocks I found nearby. I gathered dry sticks and branches for firewood, careful to ensure there were no live trees harmed, only fallen wood. I lit the fire with a match, and the flames flickered, warming me as the shadows began to stretch across the forest floor. I boiled water, ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread, and felt a deep satisfaction in the quiet rhythm of camping life. As darkness settled, the forest became a different place. Shapes shifted, the wind made the trees groan, and every small noise felt louder. The first night was uneventful, except for a few rustles from small animals. I slept lightly, waking at intervals to check that the fire had died down safely. The next morning, I woke early to the soft light filtering through the trees. I could hear birdsong, the distant rush of a stream, and the hum of insects. I ate a small breakfast and decided to explore further along the trail. The map I had showed a larger stream about a mile from the clearing. It was good exercise, and I wanted to see the water, maybe catch a fish or two. The forest felt different the farther I went. The ground was softer, the air cooler. Sunlight struggled through the dense canopy, and the trail became less defined. I kept a careful eye on my bearings, marking points with small rock piles so I could find my way back. I reached the stream by midday. It was wider than I expected, the water clear but moving quickly over rocks. I knelt and drank some water after filtering it through my small portable filter. I caught a few small fish using a makeshift trap I had packed, and I enjoyed the satisfaction of the catch. While sitting by the stream, I noticed signs of larger wildlife. Deer tracks, and deeper impressions in the mud that could have been a bear or a large canine. I didn't panic, but I felt a prickling awareness, the kind that comes when you know you are not alone in the forest. I returned to my campsite in the early afternoon, keeping my movements calm and deliberate. I reinforced the fire pit, gathered more wood, and settled in for the evening. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of rustling near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a deer or raccoon, but the sound was heavier, deliberate. My heart rate increased. I had packed a flashlight and a small hatchet, and I kept both within reach. The noises continued intermittently, circling my tent, stopping, starting again. I stayed still, trying not to make a sound. I realized the sounds were coming from multiple directions, as if something or multiple somethings were moving around outside the small circle of light cast by my dying fire. I didn't leave the tent, but I could hear the heavy steps and occasional scratching on the ground, the twigs breaking under weight. Morning came, and the forest seemed normal again. I rationalized the previous night's events as my imagination, or perhaps a large animal passing through. I packed lightly and decided to hike further into the forest, curious to see what lay beyond. The trail became rougher, steeper, and overgrown. My map showed a ridge not far from where I was, and I thought reaching it would give me a better vantage point. The climb was exhausting, the underbrush thick, and I had to use my hands to push through branches. Sweat ran down my back, my boots became soaked in mud from a hidden stream, and my muscles ached. I kept moving slowly but steadily. Halfway to the ridge, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud. They were large, human-like, but not exact. Something about them was off, uneven spacing, inconsistent depth. I paused, looking around carefully. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The wind had died down, no birds were singing. I felt a sudden wave of tension, realizing I might not be alone. I didn't see anyone, but the tracks suggested recent passage. I retraced my steps slightly, trying to pick up the trail back toward my campsite, but the trail had become harder to navigate. Branches snagged my clothing, roots twisted under my feet, and the deeper I went, the more I felt a strange weight in the air. As afternoon approached, I began to notice other signs. Tree branches had been snapped at unusual heights, some rocks moved or disturbed, and faint noises echoed in the distance. My heart rate increased steadily, and I forced myself to stay calm. I had always prepared for wildlife encounters, but this felt different. These signs suggested another human, or possibly more than one, moving through the forest with intent. I became hyper-aware of every sound: the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant sound of water, the faint rustle of branches. Every noise made me stop and listen. By evening, I had decided to return to my original campsite, but I realized I was lost. The trail markers I had made earlier were gone, covered by fallen leaves or obscured by brush. The sun was low, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I tried to keep calm, focusing on landmarks I remembered. A large boulder near a fork in the trail, a fallen log shaped like a bridge over a small stream. I kept moving, trying to maintain a direction that I thought would lead me back. The light faded quickly under the dense canopy, and soon I was navigating in near darkness. I heard movement behind me again, this time unmistakable. It wasn't a small animal. It was heavy, deliberate, and close. I quickened my pace, trying not to run and make noise, but adrenaline surged, and I ended up breaking into a fast walk, then a cautious jog. Every snap of a twig behind me made me freeze. My mind raced through possibilities. I considered a bear, but the footprints didn't match. I considered another camper or hiker, but the thought made my stomach knot. Whoever it was, they seemed to be following me, keeping a distance but staying on my trail. Hours passed like this. I stumbled through brambles, tripped over roots, and my water supply ran low. My stomach ached from hunger, but the fear was more pressing. At one point, I found a small hollow under a fallen tree and decided to hide for a while. I lay still, hardly breathing, listening. The sounds of movement continued but eventually faded, though I couldn't tell if they had left or were merely observing from a distance. The night stretched endlessly, every noise amplified, every shadow threatening. By dawn, I was exhausted. I had slept fitfully under the hollow log, waking at every sound. The first light gave me courage. I surveyed the surrounding area, recognizing a few landmarks I had seen on my way to the ridge. I carefully retraced my steps, moving slowly and deliberately, avoiding open spaces. Hours later, I stumbled onto the edge of a small creek I had passed before. Recognizing it from my earlier exploration, I followed it downstream, eventually finding the clearing where I had set my first camp. Relief washed over me in waves, almost paralyzing. I quickly gathered my belongings, packed my tent, and prepared to leave. Before leaving, I carefully checked the campsite. The fire pit was untouched, no signs of anyone else having been there, but I noticed subtle disturbances. Rocks slightly out of place, my footprints partially erased by rain overnight. Whoever had been following me had either moved on or watched from a distance. I didn't wait to find out. I followed the main trail out, using the sun and my compass to keep my direction. The hike back was tense but uneventful. Every rustle or movement made my heart race, but I maintained a steady pace, stopping only to drink water and catch my breath. By late afternoon, I emerged from the forest onto a gravel road. A passing car slowed, and the driver gave me a concerned look as I flagged them down. I explained my situation briefly. They gave me a ride to the nearest town. In the safety of the town, I called a friend to pick me up and drove back to my apartment. I unpacked my gear, examined my body for scratches or injuries, and found only minor cuts from branches and thorns. The experience left me shaken, but also deeply aware of my own resilience. Reflecting on it later, I realized several important lessons. First, preparation is everything, but even the best preparation can be tested in unexpected ways. Second, awareness of your surroundings and the ability to stay calm under stress can make the difference between a dangerous situation and a safe one. Third, human unpredictability is sometimes more frightening than wildlife or natural dangers. I kept the journal I had brought, writing a detailed account of every movement, every sound, every decision, as a reminder of what had happened. Weeks later, I returned to the forest with a friend, this time to a well-known, heavily trafficked trail. The experience had changed me. I no longer took solitude in the forest for granted. I respected the unknown and understood that being alone in the wilderness meant trusting your instincts, paying attention to subtle signs, and knowing when to retreat. I also carried a GPS device now, along with a more extensive communication setup. The forest still called to me, but I had learned that preparation, caution, and awareness were not just useful, they were essential. In the end, I survived without injury, returned to safety, and gained a deeper respect for both the wilderness and the unpredictability of human behavior. The fear I felt that night stayed with me for a long time, but it also strengthened me. I knew that the forest could be harsh and that solitude could bring real danger, but I also knew that with knowledge, caution, and determination, I could navigate it safely. The story of that camping trip became a benchmark for all future adventures. A reminder that the real horror in the wilderness comes not from myths or legends, but from reality itself, and surviving it depends entirely on your skill, awareness, and presence of mind. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The thought of spending a week alone in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, felt like a rare chance to disconnect from everything. I had chosen a remote area in a national forest that I had never been to before, somewhere far from the main trails and roadways. The idea of solitude excited me, but I also knew that solitude could be dangerous if I wasn't careful. I packed my backpack carefully, checking and rechecking every item. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for a week, plenty of water, a first aid kit, extra clothes, and navigation tools. I even carried a small emergency beacon just in case. I wanted this trip to be safe, but I also wanted it to feel real, raw, and lonely. The drive to the forest took hours. As I got closer, the paved roads disappeared, replaced by narrow, uneven dirt paths. My car bounced on the rocks, and the air smelled different, cleaner and more earthy, tinged with pine and wet soil. Finally, I reached a small clearing that seemed almost hidden among the trees. I parked my car and took a long breath. The silence hit me immediately. No birds were singing. No wind rustled through the leaves. Just a quiet, still calm that felt both peaceful and slightly unnerving. I shouldered my pack and began walking into the forest. The trail quickly became less defined. I had a rough map and GPS coordinates, but the forest was dense. Trees grew thick and close together, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. Every step I took felt heavier as I fought against roots and fallen logs. The forest floor was damp, and moss grew in thick patches. Occasionally, I would see animal tracks, maybe deer or smaller mammals, and it reminded me that I was not alone, even if I could not see anything else. The deeper I went, the more I felt a mix of exhilaration and caution. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that I had left the world behind, but also a subtle tension that grew in my chest with every step. By late afternoon, I found a small flat area near a creek, just wide enough to pitch my tent. The sound of running water was comforting. I set up the tent carefully, making sure it was anchored well because the weather could change quickly in these areas. After setting up, I gathered some firewood, careful to select dry pieces that would burn steadily. By the time I built a small fire and sat beside it, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. I ate a simple meal from my backpack, just canned beans and bread, and watched the light fade. The temperature dropped quickly, and I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, feeling the fire's warmth on my face. The first night was tense. Even though I had been camping before, something about this forest felt different. Every sound seemed amplified, the crack of a branch under a small animal, the rustle of leaves as something moved in the underbrush. My flashlight and small lantern were on, and I lay on my sleeping pad, listening. At one point, I thought I heard a low growl, distant but real. My heart thudded in my chest, but I reminded myself that it was probably a coyote or a large dog passing through. I forced myself to breathe slowly and eventually drifted off to sleep, though not fully relaxed. The following days followed a routine: waking early with the sun, collecting water from the creek and purifying it, cooking simple meals, and exploring the area during daylight. I marked the spots I had seen animals and took photographs of interesting plants and rocks. The isolation began to weigh on me. Without anyone else around, my senses felt sharper, and every sound or movement drew my attention. I became hyper-aware of how thin the ground could be in some places, how slippery the rocks were near the creek, and how unpredictable the forest could be. At times, I would pause and look around, noticing how the forest seemed almost endless, like it stretched forever in every direction. I could feel the raw power of nature, beautiful but unforgiving. On the third day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. My map showed a ridge that I wanted to reach, and I thought it would offer a great vantage point. I left my camp early in the morning, carrying my backpack and water. The hike was harder than I expected. The incline was steep, and I had to pull myself over fallen logs and push past thick brush. Around midday, I reached a small clearing with a view of the surrounding trees. The forest stretched endlessly below, a sea of green punctuated by the occasional rock face or stream. I sat on a flat boulder to rest, ate some trail mix, and felt a strange mix of triumph and isolation. This is what I had come for, I thought, the quiet, the challenge, the solitude. But as I rested, I began to notice something odd. I had walked this trail for hours, and yet there were no signs of human presence. No litter, no footprints other than mine, not even distant sounds of other hikers or vehicles. For most of the day, I had not seen anyone. Normally, even in remote areas, you might hear someone in the distance or see a trail marker, but here it was as if I were the only person in existence. A small, uneasy feeling started to creep in. By late afternoon, I began my descent. It was slower than expected. The slope was steep, and loose rocks made my footing uncertain. I became aware that, while I had taken precautions, one wrong step could lead to serious injury. I paused frequently to rest and check my map. That's when I realized something truly alarming. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The trail I thought would lead me back to my camp was no longer visible. The forest had swallowed the path entirely, leaving me surrounded by dense trees and underbrush. My GPS signal was weak. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction seemed wrong, and landmarks I thought I recognized looked different. Panic began to rise, and I forced myself to slow down, breathe, and assess the situation carefully. I knew the forest could be unforgiving. Night was approaching, and I didn't want to be lost in darkness. I checked my emergency beacon, but I wanted to try finding my way first. I tried to orient myself using the creek I had camped near, hoping to follow it downstream to my campsite. Took hours. The forest grew darker, shadows stretching and changing as the sun sank. Every sound startled me. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, distant thumps that could have been anything from falling rocks to larger animals. My body ached, my legs scratched by branches, my hands scraped by rough bark, but I kept moving, forcing myself to focus on finding the creek. Finally, just before nightfall, I heard the sound of running water. Relief surged through me. I followed the sound carefully, taking slow, deliberate steps. Eventually, I found the creek. The sight of it was a moment of triumph. I knew my camp had to be nearby, and I began following it upstream. Night fell completely as I walked beside the water. My headlamp provided only a small circle of light, and shadows seemed to grow larger around me. I felt a cold chill and realized how easily someone could get lost here and never be found if they panicked or made one wrong move. I reached my campsite late that night, exhausted, hungry, and soaked in sweat. My fire had gone out, the temperature had dropped significantly, and I felt raw fatigue. I rebuilt the fire as quickly as possible, gathering dry wood from around the site. I sat beside it for hours, shaking from exhaustion and cold, until the fire's warmth spread through my body. I ate what little food I had left and finally crawled into my tent, feeling the weight of relief mixed with lingering fear. That night, I slept deeper than the previous ones, though I remained alert to every sound outside. The next day, I decided to pack up and leave early. I didn't want to risk another disorienting hike deeper into the forest. I methodically dismantled the tent, packed my gear, and left the site exactly as I had found it. The hike back to the dirt road took the better part of the morning. My legs were sore, my feet blistered, but I was focused. When I finally reached the road and my car, I felt a profound relief. The sense of isolation, danger, and vulnerability was replaced with exhaustion and a deep appreciation for safety and civilization. As I drove home, I thought about the week I had spent. The forest had been beautiful, raw, and unforgiving. It had pushed me physically and mentally, forcing me to confront solitude, fear, and the real dangers of nature. I realized that camping was not just about being alone and enjoying scenery. It was about preparation, awareness, and respect for an environment that didn't bend to human will. By the time I reached the city, I felt a strange mix of pride and humility. The experience had been terrifying at times, but it had also shown me my limits, my resilience, and the importance of preparation. I knew I would camp again, but never without meticulous planning, careful observation, and respect for the forest's power. That week had been the closest I had ever come to feeling truly exposed and vulnerable, and it had left me with a sense of clarity, caution, and a deep understanding of what it meant to survive in the wild. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. The idea had been simple in my head. A weekend away from the city, away from the noise, away from the constant hum of life that never seemed to stop. I packed my bag carefully, making sure I had all the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, extra clothing, water, a first aid kit, a portable stove, some canned food, and a small knife I had bought for emergencies. I also brought a map of the area and a compass. I told myself I was prepared for anything, but I would soon learn how much I did not know. The drive to the trailhead was quiet. The road narrowed as I left the main highway and began following the winding path into the forest. Trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked the sun. The shadows lengthened as I drove, and by the time I reached the parking area, the air felt cooler and heavier, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. I parked my car, got out, and double-checked my pack. Everything seemed in order, though I felt a strange tension I could not explain, a tightness in my chest that I brushed off as nerves. I had been camping many times before, but something about this place felt different, more isolated, more raw. The trail started gently, a dirt path winding through tall pines and thick underbrush. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional bird call. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing beside a creek. The water was clear and fast-moving, tumbling over rocks. I filled my water bottle and rested for a moment, feeling the cool spray on my hands. I checked my map and decided to push further into the forest, aiming for a site I had marked as ideal. It was remote, with a nearby stream and enough open ground for my tent. As I walked, the trail narrowed and became less defined. Branches scraped my arms, and the undergrowth tugged at my boots. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer probably, but the pattern seemed odd, larger and irregular, almost like a bear's. I slowed, listening. The forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the faint gurgle of water. Yet, there was something unnatural in the quiet moments, a pause where no sound came at all, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook my head and kept moving, trying to focus on the trail. By late afternoon, I found a spot I thought would be perfect. A small clearing, flat ground, surrounded by thick trees that provided privacy and some wind protection. The stream was nearby, about 30 meters away, and there were enough fallen logs to sit on. I set up my tent slowly, making sure the ground sheet was secure and the tent stakes were driven deep. I arranged my backpack inside, laid out my sleeping bag, and took a moment to sit and watch the water. The sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I could feel the temperature dropping. As evening approached, I started a small fire. The crackling flames and the smell of burning would made me feel safer, even though the deepening shadows stretched across the clearing, hiding parts of the forest. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, canned beans heated slowly in a small pot. The forest seemed quiet, almost too quiet, but I reminded myself it was normal. Animals were preparing for night. My stomach full and my fire steady, I settled into a chair I had brought along, watching the flames dance. Darkness crept in quickly. The last rays of sunlight disappeared, and only the fire illuminated the clearing. That night I slept lightly. The sounds of the forest were different in the dark. Twigs snapped under the weight of unseen animals. The wind whispered through the trees, and I woke several times, uneasy for no specific reason. The next morning, I woke to mist rising from the creek. I made coffee over the fire, the smell comforting. I planned to hike a bit further along a trail I had seen on the map, to explore before heading back in the afternoon. I packed lightly, leaving most of my supplies at the campsite. The trail I took was narrow and steep in places. Roots and rocks made the path treacherous, but I moved carefully. Around mid-morning, I noticed signs of a large animal. Bark stripped from trees, deep scratches in the mud, and broken branches. My heart rate picked up. I tried to rationalize it. It could have been a bear passing through days ago, but the tracks were fresh. I paused, listening. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and my own breathing. Then I heard it. A low growl, distant but unmistakable. I froze, straining my ears. The growl came again, closer this time. I realized I might be between the animal and its territory. Slowly, I turned and started back toward my campsite, keeping my movements deliberate, trying not to make any noise. The hike back was tense. Every sound seemed amplified. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, the distant splash of water. I kept looking over my shoulder, but saw nothing. When I finally reached the clearing, I was relieved, though I noticed the fire had gone out. I quickly rebuilt it, the flame a fragile barrier against the forest's dark presence. I decided to pack up and move to a safer location further from the stream, in case the animal was still nearby. I broke down the tent carefully, storing everything in my backpack. The act of packing gave me a focus, a task to keep my mind off the unease gnawing at me. By late morning, I had hiked a few kilometers to a small ridge that overlooked the forest below. It was higher ground, open but surrounded by sparse trees, giving me visibility in all directions. I set up camp again, more quickly this time, keeping my fire small but bright. I made sure my knife was accessible and my water bottle within reach. The forest was alive with birds and insects, but I kept a wary eye on the tree line. I ate another simple meal and rested, keeping alert. The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifting, and I could feel the temperature drop again. Night would come quickly, and I did not want to be caught unprepared. That evening, I began to notice something odd. The forest, which had been filled with distant animal sounds during the day, was now eerily quiet. The usual nocturnal noises, frogs, owls, rustling leaves, were muted or absent. I told myself this was normal. Sometimes animals hide when humans are around, but the feeling of being watched pressed against me. I kept my fire small but constant, and I double-checked my surroundings. The ridge gave me a clear view of the forest below, but I felt exposed as well, vulnerable to any animal or human that might wander near. I kept my knife at my side, the firelight reflecting off its blade. Around midnight, a new sound broke the silence, a loud rustle from the trees below. My heart jumped. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping it across the slope. There, moving slowly, were two large shapes. I could not be certain, but they looked like bears. Their size and the way they moved through the undergrowth suggested adults, possibly a mother and a cub. I froze, assessing my options. Moving downhill would put me closer to them. Running was dangerous. Staying put and making noise could either scare them or provoke them. I stayed calm, watching as they foraged near the forest floor. I remained still, hoping they would move on. Hours passed with my body rigid, every sound amplified. The bears eventually wandered off, disappearing into the darkness, but the tension lingered. The rest of the night was restless. I stayed awake, taking turns watching the fire and the forest beyond. Sleep came in short bursts, uneasy and filled with vivid dreams of the bears returning, of slipping and falling down the ridge. Morning brought relief. The forest seemed normal again, filled with the sound of birds and insects. I ate quickly and began to pack. My priority was getting back to the trailhead safely. I planned my route carefully, sticking to the higher ground and avoiding dense underbrush where animals could hide. Every step was deliberate, and I kept checking my map and compass to avoid getting lost. The hike back was long and tiring. My legs ached, my shoulders were sore from carrying the pack, and the sun beat down through breaks in the canopy. I drank water frequently and took short breaks, scanning the forest continuously. The fear I had felt during the night lingered, making me jump at every sound. I reminded myself to stay calm and think clearly. By mid-afternoon, I reached a familiar marker, a large boulder I had passed on the way in. Relief washed over me. From here, the trail was easier, better defined, and I could see signs of human activity again. Litter, footprints, and distant voices from other hikers. When I finally reached my car, the sense of safety was overwhelming. I locked the doors and sat inside for a few minutes, letting the engine run and the air conditioner cool me down. The fear and tension of the past 2 days began to fade, replaced with exhaustion and relief. I realized how unprepared I had been for the unpredictability of nature. The isolation, the encounters with wildlife, and the sheer silence of the forest had tested me in ways I had not anticipated. As I drove away, I reflected on the trip. I had survived, but the experience had left a lasting impression. I had seen how fragile a human is in the face of nature, how quickly comfort and safety can vanish. I had learned the importance of preparation, vigilance, and respect for the wilderness. That night, back in my apartment, I unpacked my gear, cleaned my equipment, and made detailed notes of the trail and my experiences. I knew I would return to the forest someday, but I would do so wiser, more prepared, and with a deeper understanding of the raw, untamed world that exists beyond the reach of city life. The trip had been terrifying in ways I had not expected, but it ended with clarity and perspective. I survived the bears, the isolation, and the fear, and I returned with not just memories but lessons etched into my mind. The forest remained wild and indifferent, but I had learned how to navigate it carefully, to respect it, and to recognize that the real danger comes not from stories or myths, but from the tangible, real challenges of nature itself.